Hey, welcome back to Teaching Them. I'm Michael Keens, and I have a lesson for you today called Obedience Plinko. You might have heard of Plinko before. Plinko is a game that they play on The Price is Right, and I think there are also some versions available online. And so I wanted to use that in order to teach kids about obedience to God and staying in God's will. And so this game is going to help us to do that. I'm using the scripture from Matthew 21, verse 28 to 31, the first part of 31, and it's the parable of the two sons. It says, "But what do you think about this?" This is Jesus talking. "A man with two sons told the older boy, 'Son, go out and work in the vineyard today.' The son answered, 'No, I won't go.' But later he changed his mind and he went anyway. Then the father told the other son, 'You go.' And he said, 'Yes, sir, I will.' But he didn't go. Which of the two obeyed his father?" So that's a scripture where Jesus is teaching about really what I'm looking for is obedience. Who's going to do what I ask them to do? So I would tell the kids, this is an interesting story. We have one kid who said, I won't go, but then he eventually did. And another kid who said, I will go, but he didn't. He shirked off his responsibility. Which of the two do you think was obedient to the father? And the answer is obviously the first one. Even though he said no at first, he eventually did what the father asked him to do. Well, sometimes in life we can do the same thing. We can start off bad and then we can end up in God's will. Or sometimes we can start off in God's will and we can end up in sin and disobedience. And so this will teach the kids how to do it. So, I have at the end of this video, I have a kind of a montage where you can see how I built this board so that you can build it yourselves. It's basically made out of cardboard and some wooden skewers that I've kind of poked through it. Some paint and some tape is basically the ingredients that you're going to need for this. And then I have some pucks, like hockey pucks, and they say "you" on them. And so what I've done with that is I've gotten some icebreaker candies, and I've kind of taken the container that the icebreakers come in and then put my sign on top of there. And then I put some weights in here. I use some nuts and bolts to just weigh it down a little bit, but you can use washers or coins or anything like that to give it a little weight. I found it sticks to the board a little bit better as it's going down. Now the idea is that the red parts are disobedience and leading into sin, and then the white parts are obedience that lead into God's will. And the kids, you can invite them up one at a time and let them try, and they're going to put the U up at the top, and it's going to go through all the pegs that are here. Now the pegs represent choices that we make in life, and the choices can bounce us around into disobedience or into obedience. And so it's just kind of a fun way to show that our choices affect whether or not we stay in God's will. So I'm going to start the puck here, and we're going to see what happens. We're going to start off in obedience. Oh no, I ended up in sin at the bottom. So that's sometimes the way it goes. We can start off well, but then we end up in sin. Okay, I'm going to start over here in disobedience. Oh, I ended up in God's will. So you can play this and let the kids have a little fun with it, and then debrief it. Talk about, well, what happened? If you started over here, did you always end up in sin? No. Sometimes you go to God's will. Well, if you start in obedience, do you always end up in God's will? Not always. Sometimes your choices will bounce you over into disobedience. And then talk to the kids about, well, what does that look like for your life? How are you responding to the things that you're asked to do by your parents or by the Bible? Are you staying in obedience? Of course, we want to start in obedience and end in obedience in God's will, if possible. But sometimes our choices affect that. All these choices are important along the way. It's not just how you start. Of course, we want to start in obedience, but it's also how your choices along the way affect whether or not you stay in God's will. You can make the connection that this is similar to the story that we read from Matthew 21, where one son started in obedience, ended up in disobedience, and another son started in disobedience, but ended up in obedience. And then which one is really the what the Lord wants? The Lord is gracious to us if we are in disobedience, but then our choices bring us back into obedience, and He will honor that. But if we start in obedience and we actually don't do it, it has no value. It has no value for our spiritual walk. It's disobedience. However, we end up if our choices lead us to do something different than what God asks us to do. If our parents ask us to clean our room and we say, "Yeah, Mom, I'll do it," and then at the end of the day it's still not done, that's still disobedience. So fun game. Definitely watch the montage if you want to create a board for yourself. If you want to print this lesson, it's at www.teachingthem.org, and I hope it's a fun one for you. I'll see you next time. God bless you.